Picture this, a hill in Bohemia, summer of 1420, the air tastes of smoke and iron. Below, stretching across the valley like a metallic sea, 100,000 men advance. Knights in polished plate armour, war horses draped in chainmail, banners of the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States, Hungary, Austria, Saxony, half of Christendom united for a single purpose: extermination. Above them, on the ridge called Vitkov, stands something that shouldn't exist. Wooden wagons chained together in a crude circle. Inside, farmers, miners, blacksmiths, women clutching makeshift spears, priests who've traded prayer books for crossbows. They number perhaps 4,000. They have no cavalry, no professional soldiers, no right to survive the next hour, and commanding them, a man who cannot see. His left eye socket is a scarred ruin, collapsed years ago from an arrow wound. His right eye, clouded and weeping, can barely distinguish shadow from light. He stands perfectly still while his lieutenants describe the apocalypse climbing toward them. The thunder of hooves, the screaming of horses, the rhythmic crash of armour. He listens. He smells the dust rising from 10,000 war horses. He feels the vibration through his boots. Then he smiles. "Let them come closer," he says. His voice carries no fear. They're too confident. They think God is with them. His name is Žižka. He is 60 years old. He has been fighting since before most of these knights were born. And he is about to do something that military historians still struggle to explain. The first rank of crusaders reaches the wagon line. They expect the peasants to break, to flee, to kneel and beg for the mercy of the church. Instead, the wagons erupt. Handgunners, primitive firearms packed with black powder and iron shrapnel, fire point blank into the mass of horses and men. The sound is like the sky cracking open. Smoke billows across the ridge. War horses scream, rearing, throwing their riders. Knights in 60 pounds of armour crash to the ground and cannot rise. Through the gaps in the wagons, farmers with flails modified into weapons of war swing at the fallen knights. The flails, originally designed to thresh wheat, have been fitted with iron spikes and weighted chains. They cave in helmets. They shatter kneecaps through plate armour. They find the gaps between gorget and breastplate. The screaming doesn't stop for hours. When it ends, the greatest army ever assembled against a single province is retreating down the hill. Behind them, piles of corpses in expensive armour. War horses with their legs broken, shrieking until peasants cut their throats. Knights drowning in blood inside their own helmets. The blind man stands amid the carnage. He cannot see the bodies, but he can smell them. Copper, excrement, the particular sweetness of opened bowels. "Count the dead," he orders, "and strip the armour. We'll need it for the next crusade." Because he knows they'll be back. The Pope has declared every Hussite, every follower of the burned priest Jan Hus, a heretic deserving death. There will be more crusades, more knights, more armies, and Jan Žižka, blind, aging, commanding an army of peasants armed with farming tools, will break them all. But this isn't that story. Not yet. To understand how a blind man defeated the combined might of medieval Christendom, we need to go back to a younger Žižka, when he still had both eyes, when he still believed in kings, when he still thought war had rules, back to when he learned that it didn't. How does a man lose everything, his eyes, his faith, his world, and become more dangerous than he ever was before? The smell of smoke reached the camp before the messenger did. Jan Žižka first killed a man at 14. The details have been lost to time, but what survives tells us enough. He was born around 1360 into minor Bohemian nobility, a family with a name but no money, land but no power. In the brutal calculus of medieval Europe, this meant one career path: war. By 20 he was a mercenary. By 30 he had fought in more battles than most knights saw in a lifetime. He served whoever paid, Bohemian nobles, Polish kings, Lithuanian princes. He fought against the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where he witnessed the largest cavalry engagement in medieval history. 40,000 men collided on a Polish field. The slaughter lasted 9 hours. Historians still debate whether Žižka commanded a unit at Grunwald or merely fought in the ranks. What's certain is what he learned there. He learned that heavy cavalry, the armoured knight on horseback that dominated European warfare for centuries, was not invincible. At Grunwald, the Teutonic Knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Christendom, were surrounded and annihilated by a combined Polish-Lithuanian force that used terrain, timing and deception to neutralize their charge. He watched knights drown in their own armour when their horses fell. He saw how panic spread through ranks like fire through dry grass. He noticed how the crash of the initial cavalry charge, so terrifying from a distance, became chaos and confusion up close, horses rearing, riders blind inside their helmets, formations collapsing into a writhing mass of steel and flesh, and he understood something that would change history. The armoured knight was a weapon designed to break peasant morale. Once the peasants stopped running, the knight became a liability. But these lessons lived only in his mind. He had no army, no authority. He was a sword for hire, drifting across Europe's endless wars, growing older, growing harder, losing pieces of himself along the way. He lost his left eye sometime before 1410. The sources disagree on how. Some say an arrow in battle, others claim a hunting accident. The wound healed badly. The socket collapsed into a permanent ruin of scar tissue. For the rest of his life he would be called One Eye before he became the Blind. He fought in the Hussite civil conflicts before they had a name. He served King Wenceslaus Thor of Bohemia, a drunk and a failure who pawned the Bohemian crown jewels to buy more wine. He watched the nobility tear the kingdom apart for scraps while the church grew fat on indulgences. According to some accounts, he grew disgusted. Not with violence. He had made peace with violence long ago. But with the lie that violence served. The knight spoke of chivalry, of honour, of God's will made manifest through the sword. Žižka knew what he had seen, knights massacring prisoners because feeding them was expensive. Crusaders burning villages of fellow Christians over theological disputes no peasant understood. Holy wars that were really land grabs dressed in scripture. He was approaching 50. His body was a map of scars. His one good eye was beginning to cloud. He had killed more men than he could count, and for what? The wars never ended. The causes never mattered. The nobles who hired him married their children to the nobles he'd fought, and the peasants who died were forgotten before their bodies cooled. Historians still debate whether Žižka experienced a genuine religious conversion, or simply found a cause worth killing for. The truth is probably both. Because in 1415, something happened that set Bohemia on fire. A priest named Jan Hus was burned alive at the Council of Constance. His crime, telling the truth about the church. Hus had preached that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority, that priests should live in poverty, not luxury, that selling indulgences, promises of reduced time in purgatory for cash, was simony, the sin of buying and selling sacred things. The church invited him to defend his views. They promised safe conduct. Then they arrested him, tried him for heresy, and burned him at the stake. His last words, according to witnesses, "You are roasting a goose, but in 100 years a swan will arise whom you will not be able to burn." When news reached Bohemia, the kingdom erupted, and Jan Žižka, one-eyed mercenary, killer for hire, veteran of a dozen forgotten wars, found something he'd never had before, a reason to fight. That decision would haunt him before sunrise. In 1415, Jan Hus became ash. By 1419, Bohemia had become a powder keg with a lit fuse, and Jan Žižka, nearly 60 years old, half-blind, his body a ruin of old wounds, stood ready to strike the match. The movement that coalesced around Hus's memory called itself the Hussite Reformation. Its followers demanded communion in both kinds. Bread and wine for laypeople, not just priests. They demanded church reform. They demanded that their martyred prophet be recognized as a saint, not a heretic. Rome refused. The Pope declared Hussitism a heresy punishable by death. King Wenceslaus Thor, caught between his Hussite subjects and his Catholic obligations, did what he always did. He drank and hoped the problem would solve itself. It didn't. Throughout 1419, tensions escalated. Hussite preachers drew crowds of thousands. Catholic priests were attacked in the streets. Churches were stormed. Their golden ornaments stripped and distributed to the poor. The smell of incense was replaced by the smell of smoke as religious images burned in public squares. Žižka watched. He listened. And he planned. According to contemporary accounts, he had joined the radical Hussite faction by early 1419. Not the moderates who wanted negotiation, not the nobles who hoped to extract concessions from the church. He joined the Taborites, named for Mount Tabor, where they believed Christ would return, who wanted nothing less than the complete destruction of the Catholic hierarchy. They recognized what he was, a professional killer in a movement of amateurs, a man who had spent 40 years learning how armies broke. While Hussite preachers quoted scripture, Žižka quoted casualty figures. While priests debated theology, he counted weapons. On July 30th, 1419, it began. A Hussite procession marched through Prague's new town, led by a radical priest named Jan Želivský. They carried the communion chalice, symbol of their demand for wine as well as bread, and sang hymns that the church had banned. Someone threw a stone from the new town hall. Historians still debate whether the stone hit anyone, whether it was aimed at the priest or the chalice, whether it was thrown by a Catholic councillor or simply a frightened servant. What happened next is not debated. The crowd stormed the building. Žižka was there. Some accounts place him at the front, others say he directed from nearby. What's certain is that when the mob reached the upper floors, they found the Catholic councillors who had ordered stones thrown at their procession. The councillors begged for mercy. They offered money. They invoked the king's protection. The crowd threw them out the windows. 7 men fell. The drop was 40 feet onto cobblestones. Some died on impact. Others lay broken on the street screaming until the mob finished them with clubs and farming tools. Their bodies were stripped. Their offices were looted. The building burned. This was the first defenestration of Prague. It would not be the last. When King Wenceslaus heard the news, he reportedly suffered a stroke from rage. He died 2 weeks later, leaving no clear heir. The Bohemian throne was suddenly vacant. The Catholic powers of Europe saw an opportunity to crush the heresy before it spread. And Žižka saw something else entirely. He saw that the peasants who threw those councillors from the windows were not afraid. They had killed representatives of royal authority and felt no remorse. The fear that kept peasants obedient, fear of nobles, fear of church, fear of hell itself, had broken. Men who are not afraid of dying, he knew, are almost impossible to defeat. But they needed training. They needed weapons. They needed someone who could transform religious fury into military discipline. They needed him. In the autumn of 1419, Žižka began building his army. He sent recruiters to villages throughout southern Bohemia. He called for volunteers, not soldiers, but believers. Farmers who could swing a flail, miners who understood explosives, blacksmiths who could forge weapons, women who could load crossbows. He promised them nothing but hardship and probable death. They came anyway. By winter, he had several thousand. They camped in the hills around a site they called Tabor, their Mount Tabor, where they would await either Christ's return or the Pope's armies. They got the armies first. Before we see how this ends, understand one thing. What Žižka was attempting had never been done. No peasant army had ever defeated professional knights in sustained warfare. No religious movement had ever survived a papal crusade. No blind commander had ever won a battle, let alone a war. Everything he was about to do was impossible. He did it anyway. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week of silence that felt like drowning. After the defenestration, the Catholic powers mobilized with a speed that surprised even Žižka. Emperor Sigismund of Hungary, brother of the dead King Wenceslaus and claimant to the Bohemian throne, declared the Hussites enemies of Christendom. Pope Martin V issued a papal bull authorizing a crusade. From Vienna to Rome, from Paris to Krakow, the message spread. Bohemia must be purified by fire. But Žižka had not been idle. Through the winter of 1419 to 1420, he transformed Tabor from a religious camp into a fortress city. The site was naturally defensible, a hilltop surrounded by rivers on 3 sides. But natural defences meant nothing against a determined siege. He needed walls. He needed weapons. He needed an army that could fight. The walls rose from wood and earth, packed tight and reinforced with stone where they could find it. The weapons came from everywhere. Farming tools modified for war, crossbows captured from Catholic raids, handguns purchased from German merchants who cared more about profit than heresy. And the army was something new. Historians still debate whether Žižka invented the tactics he used or adapted them from earlier experiments. What's certain is that he systematized them into something that had never existed before. A peasant army built around gunpowder and defensive warfare. He rejected the cavalry charge that defined medieval combat. His people had no horses worth riding, no armour worth wearing, no tradition of mounted warfare. Trying to fight like knights would mean dying like peasants. Instead, he would make the knights fight like peasants. The core of his system was the war wagon. Take a farm cart, reinforce the sides with thick wooden planks, cut holes for crossbows and handguns, chain multiple wagons together to form a mobile fortress, put the shooters inside where cavalry can't reach them. It was crude, it was ugly. It violated every principle of noble warfare. It worked. By spring 1420, Žižka had several hundred war wagons and several thousand fighters trained to use them. He drilled them relentlessly, when to chain the wagons, how to reload under fire, where to position the handguns for maximum carnage. He taught them something else too, something that the chronicles record with a mixture of admiration and horror. He taught them to feel nothing. "Mercy is for those who can afford it," he reportedly told his captains. "We cannot afford it. The enemy will show us none. We will show them the same." Captured knights were executed. Prisoners were taken only if they could be ransomed for weapons. Collaborators, Bohemians who remained loyal to Rome, were killed without trial. The Hussite armies became famous, then infamous, for their brutality. But the brutality had a purpose. Žižka understood that his peasants were terrified. They had been told their entire lives that knights were invincible, that the church spoke for God, that rebellion meant eternal damnation. The only way to break that fear was to replace it with something stronger: hatred. He made them hate the enemy more than they feared death. He told them about Jan Hus burning, about the indulgences that robbed their families, about the bishops who lived in palaces while their children starved. He transformed a religious movement into a machine of righteous vengeance. And then the First Crusade arrived. In early 1420, Emperor Sigismund crossed into Bohemia with an army that the chronicles describe as overwhelming. Estimates vary wildly. Some sources claim 100,000 men, others suggest 30,000, but all agree it was the largest force assembled against a single province in living memory. They expected easy victory. The Hussites were peasants. They had no cavalry. They had no professional soldiers. They had a half-blind old man commanding them. The Crusaders advanced on Prague, which had declared for the Hussites. Sigismund offered terms: submit to the church, accept him as king, surrender the heretic leaders for execution. Prague refused. The siege began. Sigismund's forces surrounded the city, cutting off food supplies, launching assaults against the walls. Inside, the citizens starved and prayed, and outside, moving through the forests of southern Bohemia, with his wagon train and his army of believers, Jan Žižka prepared to do the impossible. He was outnumbered at least 5-1. His soldiers had never faced professional knights in open battle. His tactics were untested. His weapons were improvised. None of that mattered, because Žižka knew something that Sigismund didn't. Knights needed flat ground to charge. They needed room to build momentum. They needed their enemies to stand in neat formations and wait to be trampled. Žižka had no intention of giving them any of those things. While the Spartans waited on the ridge, the enemy was already moving through the passes. That classical analogy would have meant nothing to Žižka's peasant army. They knew no Greek history. Most couldn't read, but they understood what their one-eyed general was asking them to do: hold a hill against the most powerful army in Europe, with nothing but farm carts and faith. Vitkov Hill rose east of Prague, commanding the road that supplied Sigismund's siege. If the Crusaders held it, they could starve the city into submission. If the Hussites held it, they could bleed the Crusaders until winter forced retreat. Both sides understood the stakes. Žižka arrived in early July 1420 with perhaps 4,000 fighters, some accounts say fewer. Against them, Sigismund committed a fraction of his army, confident that peasants couldn't hold a fortified position against professional soldiers. He was wrong. The Hussites dug in. They chained their war wagons into a circular fortress called a wagonburg, the first systematic use of this formation in European warfare. Inside the circle, crossbowmen and handgunners prepared their weapons. Outside, ditches were dug and sharpened stakes planted. On July 14th, the Crusaders attacked. Historians still debate whether Sigismund expected serious resistance or simply planned to sweep the rabble off the hill before lunch. What happened instead rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. The first wave of knights charged up the slope. The ground was uneven, scattered with rocks and stumps, impossible terrain for a cavalry charge. The horses slowed. The formation broke apart. Individual knights reached the wagon line in clusters, not ranks. The wagons erupted. Handguns fired at point-blank range. The sound, a crack like thunder trapped in a box, panicked horses that had never heard gunfire. Smoke billowed across the hilltop, blinding the attackers. Knights fell from rearing horses and couldn't rise in their armour. Then the peasants came out. Through gaps in the wagon line, Hussite infantry surged with weapons that shouldn't have worked against armoured knights, but did. Modified flails with spiked iron heads, war hammers designed to dent helmets and shatter kneecaps, long hooked poles that pulled riders from saddles. The fighting was intimate and brutal. No heroic duels, no chivalric gestures. Peasant women stabbed at fallen knights with kitchen knives, finding the gaps between armour plates, armpits, groin, the visor slots of helmets. The first assault fell back. The second assault was larger. Sigismund committed more knights, determined to overwhelm the position with numbers. They formed up at the base of the hill, hundreds of armoured cavalry, and charged. They made it farther than the first wave. Some reached the wagons, some began hacking at the wooden walls with swords and axes. For perhaps 20 minutes, the outcome was uncertain. Then the Hussite women began throwing things: stones, boiling water, pots of burning pitch, anything that would burn or break or blind. According to contemporary accounts, the women of Tabor fought alongside the men, not a common practice in medieval warfare, with a ferocity that shocked the Crusaders. They were demons, one German chronicler wrote, not women at all, but creatures sent from hell to punish Christian knights for their sins. The second assault broke. By evening, the Crusaders had lost hundreds of men and gained nothing. Sigismund, watching from a safe distance, reportedly flew into a rage. He had expected to crush the rebellion in weeks. Now he faced the prospect of a long siege against an enemy who refused to fight fairly. On July 22nd, he tried again. This time he committed the bulk of his cavalry. Thousands of knights in what should have been an irresistible charge. The result was the same. Worse, actually. The Hussites had used the week between assaults to strengthen their positions. More ditches, more stakes, more handguns shipped up from Tabor. When the cavalry charged, they hit a wall of fire and iron that no amount of courage could breach. By nightfall, Sigismund's army was retreating from Prague. The First Crusade was over. Against every expectation, against every rule of medieval warfare, peasants with farm tools had defeated the combined might of Catholic Europe. Jan Žižka, one-eyed and nearly 60, had proven something that would echo across the next 4 centuries. Gunpowder changed everything. The armoured knight, dominant for 500 years, was obsolete. The future belonged to whoever could put the most firearms in the most hands. But Žižka's war was just beginning, because the Pope didn't accept the verdict. The Emperor didn't accept the verdict. The Catholic powers of Europe looked at Vitkov Hill and saw not a lesson but an embarrassment. A temporary setback that more men and more money would correct. They would send more crusades, and Žižka, his one remaining eye growing cloudier by the month, would break them all. Victory was declared at noon. The dying didn't stop until nightfall. After Vitkov, Žižka had time to think. The Crusaders would return. That was certain. They would return with more men, better preparation, lessons learned from their failures. He needed to be ready. Through the autumn and winter of 1420, he refined his system. The war wagon, which had been an improvised solution, became a standardized weapon. Each wagon was built to precise specifications: thick oak planking that could stop a crossbow bolt, firing ports at regular intervals, chains welded into permanent attachment points. He organized his army into wagon crews, each wagon manned by a specific team that trained together, fought together, lived together. A typical crew included crossbowmen, handgunners, a driver, and infantry who would sally out during pauses in enemy attacks. Every crew knew its position in the Wagenburg formation. Every crew had backup responsibilities if neighbouring wagons fell. This was revolutionary. Medieval armies were collections of individual warriors fighting side by side. Žižka created integrated units where every person had a function, and no function was more important than another. He also standardized the weapons. The handgun of 1420 was a crude thing. a metal tube mounted on a wooden stick, fired by touching a lit match to a hole in the barrel. It was inaccurate, slow to reload, and dangerous to its user. But it had one overwhelming advantage. It could punch through plate armor at close range. Žižka ordered hundreds of handguns manufactured. He experimented with different powder mixtures, different barrel lengths, different firing mechanisms. By 1421, his handguns were more reliable than anything else in Europe. He added Hofneis, primitive artillery pieces that could lob stone or iron balls into cavalry formations. The name would eventually evolve into the English word howitzer. He developed the Tarasnes, a small cannon that could be mounted on a wagon and fired on the move. Historians still debate whether Žižka invented these weapons or simply was the first commander to use them systematically. What's certain is that he integrated them into a tactical doctrine that no European army could match for decades. But the weapons were only part of his innovation. The deeper revolution was psychological. Žižka understood that his peasants were fighting for something the Crusaders weren't: survival. The knights who charged his wagons had homes to return to if the campaign failed. The peasants inside those wagons knew that defeat meant death, not just for them, but for their families, their communities, their entire way of life. He weaponized that desperation. He held services before every battle where priests reminded the fighters what they were defending. He distributed captured Catholic treasures among his soldiers, making them literally invested in victory. He promoted common farmers to command positions based on ability, not birth, something unheard of in medieval warfare. And he showed no mercy. After battles, his armies executed prisoners. They razed Catholic villages. They burned churches and monasteries that had taken centuries to build. The Hussite Wars became synonymous with destruction, and Žižka became synonymous with the Hussite Wars. According to some accounts, he struggled with this. He was a soldier, not a fanatic. He had spent his life fighting for money, not causes. The slaughter he now directed was different from anything in his mercenary past. Historians still debate whether he truly believed in the Hussite cause or simply found it useful. The truth probably lies somewhere between. He believed enough to fight. He believed enough to kill. Whether he believed enough to die, that question would be answered soon. Because in 1421, the Second Crusade was assembling. This time, the Pope took personal interest. He appointed a legate to command the expedition. He extracted commitments from German princes who had sat out the First Crusade. He promised indulgences to anyone who joined, automatic forgiveness of sins for killing heretics. The army that gathered was even larger than Sigismund's force. Some sources claim 200,000 men. Even the conservative estimates suggest 100,000. Against them, Žižka had perhaps 25,000 fighters and a few hundred war wagons. And here's where it gets worse. Because during the winter of 1421, while training his army for the coming campaign, Jan Žižka was hit by an arrow. It struck his right eye, his only remaining eye. Within weeks, he was completely blind. At 60 years old, facing the largest army ever assembled against Bohemia, the one-eyed general became the no-eyed general. Anyone else would have retired, would have handed command to younger men, would have accepted that God or fate or simple bad luck had finally ended his war. Žižka refused. "I have fought blind men," he reportedly said. "Now I will fight as one." The smell of smoke reached the camp before the messenger did. By summer 1421, the Second Crusade had entered Bohemia. The chronicles describe it as a flood. Column after column of knights, infantry, siege equipment, supply wagons, priests with portable altars, prostitutes and merchants and all the parasites that followed medieval armies. They advanced in 3 divisions, planning to converge on Prague and crush the heresy between them. They never reached the capital. Žižka, completely blind now, commanded from a wagon in the centre of his wagonburg. He couldn't see the battlefield. He couldn't read reports. He couldn't observe enemy movements or signal his officers with visual commands. He didn't need to. 40 years of warfare had burned the patterns into his mind. The sound of cavalry forming up. The particular thunder of a charge at full gallop versus a hesitant advance. The rhythm of disciplined infantry versus panicked retreat. The smell of gunpowder smoke. How it hung in still air. How it drifted in wind. What it meant about where his handguns were firing. He had his captains describe the terrain in precise detail. Every hill, every stream, every patch of woods. He built the battlefield in his mind and held it there, updating it with every report. The Crusaders expected easy victory. They outnumbered the Hussites 4-1. They had knights in plate armour, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. They had God on their side, or so the Pope assured them. They met Žižka at Kutna Hora in December 1421. The battle began conventionally. The Crusaders formed their cavalry for a charge. The Hussites circled their wagons and waited. It should have been a replay of Vitkov, another bloody assault against prepared defences. Then Žižka did something new. Instead of waiting for the attack, he ordered his wagons to advance. The entire wagonberg, hundreds of carts chained together, bristling with crossbows and handguns, began rolling toward the enemy. The Crusaders had never seen anything like it. A fortress that moved, a wall that attacked. The ground shook, not from cavalry hooves, but from wooden wheels grinding over frozen earth. The crash of chains and the creak of axles created a sound like some mechanical beast awakening. The Crusader cavalry charged. They had to. Letting a mobile fortress reach their infantry would be catastrophic. Thousands of knights spurred their horses forward, lances levelled, expecting to shatter the wagons with momentum. They hit the wagonberg at full speed and stopped. The wagons were heavier than they looked. The chains held. The cavalry charge, the most devastating weapon in medieval warfare, simply failed. Horses crashed into wooden walls and fell screaming. Knights were thrown from saddles and crushed under hooves. Those who reached the wagons found no enemies to fight, only firing ports spitting death. The handguns erupted. Point-blank range. The sound was like the world ending. Smoke swallowed the battlefield. Visibility dropped to nothing. In the chaos, cavalry became a liability. Horses panicked, riders blind inside their helmets, formations dissolving into a screaming mass of metal and flesh. Through the smoke, Hussite infantry poured out. This was the moment Žižka had planned for. Cavalry trapped against immobile wagons could be picked apart at leisure. He had trained his infantry for exactly this. Flood out during the chaos, hammer the fallen, retreat before the enemy could reform. The flails rose and fell, the crack of iron on armour, the wet crunch of skulls inside helmets. Knights who had survived the initial collision were dragged from wounded horses and beaten to death by farmers who had never held swords. By nightfall, the Crusader army was in retreat. Not organised retreat, rout, panic. Knights throwing off armour to run faster, infantry abandoning weapons, the siege equipment that was supposed to level Prague left burning on the road. Žižka pursued. For 3 days, his wagon army chased the remnants of the Second Crusade across Bohemia. Villages that had welcomed the Crusaders as liberators watched Hussite wagons roll through, their commanders collecting tribute and their soldiers collecting heads. The chronicles record massacres, prisoners executed, collaborators hanged, churches burned with their congregations inside. The Hussites had learned that mercy meant nothing to Rome. The Pope would keep sending armies until every heretic was dead, so they showed no mercy in return. Žižka, blind in his wagon, listened to the reports. The dead at Kutna Hora, the villages burned in pursuit. The prisoners killed because feeding them was impossible. According to some accounts, he wept. According to others, he laughed. Probably both were true. The battle is over. The real tragedy is just beginning. Ironic contrast. He had won everything and could see nothing. After Kutna Hora, Jan Žižka was the most feared commander in Europe. The Pope's crusade had shattered against his wagons. The finest knights of Christendom had fled before peasants armed with farming tools. The Hussite Revolution, which every expert predicted would be crushed in months, had survived 2 years against the combined might of Catholic Europe, and its leader was completely, utterly blind. The sources describe his condition in sparse terms. His right eye, destroyed by the arrow in 1421, left a wound that never fully healed. The socket wept constantly. Infection was a constant threat. He wrapped his face in cloth to keep out dust and light that caused him pain he could no longer see. He was 62 years old. His body, never fully recovered from 4 decades of warfare, was failing. He needed help to walk. He needed help to eat. He needed his lieutenants to tell him where he was, who was around him, what was happening beyond the blackness. He commanded anyway. The Third Crusade assembled in 1422. Once again, the Pope called on Catholic Europe to destroy the Bohemian heresy. Once again, German princes and Hungarian nobles gathered armies. Once again, over 100,000 men marched toward Prague. This time, Žižka didn't wait for them. He understood that defensive warfare, however successful, couldn't win the war. Each crusade damaged Bohemia, burned villages, devastated harvests, killed thousands of people he needed to survive the next campaign. To truly defeat the Catholics, he needed to take the fight to them. In the spring of 1422, Hussite armies crossed into Moravia, then into Austria, then into Saxony and Brandenburg. For the first time, the war that had been fought on Bohemian soil spilled into Catholic territory. Historians still debate whether these raids were strategic or simply punitive. The Hussites burned monasteries, they sacked towns, they collected tribute from terrified German princes who paid anything to make them leave. Žižka led some of these expeditions personally. Blind, sick, aging, he rode in his command wagon while his armies devastated the countryside. He couldn't see the burning villages, but he could smell the smoke. He could hear the screaming. According to one chronicler, he never ordered the killing of children. According to another, he didn't have to. His soldiers needed no such orders. The Third Crusade reached Bohemia in late 1422. It was smaller than the Second. Many German princes had already felt Hussite raiders and had no appetite for more. But it was still overwhelming. Perhaps 80,000 men against Žižka's 20,000. They met at Nemeki Brod in January 1422. The battle followed the pattern Žižka had established. Wagons circled, handgunners loaded, cavalry charged and broke, infantry poured out through the gaps. But this time, something was different. The Crusaders had learned. They didn't commit their entire cavalry at once. They probed for weaknesses, they tried to outflank the Wagenburg. They brought their own primitive firearms and tried to match the Hussite volleys. It wasn't enough. Žižka had anticipated adaptation. He had trained his crews for exactly this: fluid defense, rapid repositioning, the ability to shift the Wagenburg shape in response to enemy movements. Where the Crusaders probed, they found reinforced positions. Where they flanked, they found fresh volleys. The battle lasted most of the day. When it ended, the Crusaders were retreating again. Again, they left thousands dead. Again, the Hussite peasants stripped armor from corpses and melted it for new weapons. But Žižka knew the truth. These victories were consuming him. Each battle killed farmers he couldn't replace. Each campaign burned villages that wouldn't recover for generations. Each triumph brought him closer to the day when Rome would send an army too large to defeat, or when his own body would finally fail, and the revolution was fracturing. The Hussites had never been unified. The moderate Utraquists wanted reform within the church. The radical Taborites wanted to destroy the church entirely. A group called the Adamites believed Christ was returning any day and clothing was sinful. Another group, the Orobites, followed priests who claimed direct communication with God. These factions had cooperated against the Crusades. Now, with external pressure eased, they turned on each other. Žižka, who had held them together through force of personality and military genius, found himself mediating disputes he couldn't see, between people whose faces he couldn't read, over theological questions he didn't understand. The man who had broken Christendom's finest armies was losing control of his own movement, and the Fourth Crusade was already gathering. The sound reached him first. Hoofbeats, thousands of them, then the smell, horse sweat, leather, the particular metallic tang of army on the march. "How many?" Žižka asked. 50,000, his lieutenant said. "Maybe more. The column stretches beyond the horizon." The Fourth Crusade had entered Bohemia in the summer of 1423. This time, the Pope had appointed a military commander, not a church legate. This time, the army moved with professional discipline. This time, Rome intended to finish what it had started. Žižka had perhaps 15,000 fighters. His wagons were battered from constant campaigning. His gunpowder supplies were running low. His best captains were exhausted, some openly questioning whether the blind man could continue leading. He chose his ground carefully. The field at Malashov sloped gently upward toward a ridge crowned with trees. The approach was open, good ground for cavalry. The flanks were protected by streams that would slow any attempt at encirclement. From the ridge, handguns could fire downward into advancing formations. Perfect defensive terrain. Žižka arrived first and spent 2 days preparing. He had the ground described to him in exhaustive detail. every rise, every dip, every patch of soft earth where cavalry would slow. He walked the perimeter of his Wagenburg, counting steps, memorizing the shape of the fortress he couldn't see. His captains watched with something between admiration and horror. The old man moved through total darkness, his hands trailing along wagon sides, his feet feeling for obstacles. He stopped at firing ports and had soldiers describe the field of fire. He checked chain connections by touch, testing for weakness. He sees with his fingers, one chronicler recorded, and he hears with his skin. The darkness has sharpened him. The Crusaders arrived on a hot August morning. Their commander was confident. He had learned from previous failures. He wouldn't charge blindly into the Wagenburg. Instead, he would surround it, starve it, force the Hussites to break formation and fight in the open where cavalry would destroy them. Žižka anticipated this. At dawn on the day of battle, he ordered a sortie. Not a desperate breakout, a calculated strike. His best cavalry, the Hussites had acquired horses through years of captured Crusaders, charged the Crusader supply train while the main army was still deploying. The supply wagons burned, food for 50,000 men gone in an hour. The Crusader commander was furious. He had planned a siege, but sieges require supplies. Now he had to attack immediately before his army starved. The cavalry charge came at midday. Žižka stood in his command wagon listening. The thunder of hooves, the screaming of horses, the crash of the first wave hitting his wagons. South wall holding? Holding, my lord? North flank. They're trying to hook around the stream. Send the reserves, not all, half. Keep the rest. He was conducting a battle he couldn't see, with information that was already outdated by the time he received it. Every decision was a gamble. Every order was an act of faith. The reserves reinforced the north flank just as the Crusader cavalry found a ford across the stream. The fighting there was savage, hand to hand in shallow water, blood turning the current red. They're breaking through on the south. Which wagon? Third from the corner, the crew is dead. Fill the gap with infantry. Order the howitzers to concentrate fire. The howitzers, primitive cannon that lobbed stone balls in high arcs, had been held in reserve. Now they roared, dropping explosives into the Crusader cavalry mass. Horses screamed, men screamed. The charge faltered. Historians still debate whether Žižka's tactics at Malešov were genius or luck. The truth is probably both. He had trained for this his entire life. Every battle he'd fought, every lesson he'd learned, had prepared him for the moment when he could no longer see. The darkness didn't diminish him, it distilled him. By evening, the Crusaders were retreating, again. Their commander, who had sworn to destroy the heretics or die trying, fled with the remnants of his cavalry. He would not return. The Fourth Crusade was finished. Žižka had won his greatest victory, blind, outnumbered 3-1, against a professional army specifically designed to counter his tactics. It was impossible. He did it anyway. But victory no longer tasted like victory. The fields around Malešov were carpeted with dead. Crusaders, yes, but also Hussites, his own people. Farmers who had followed him because they believed God was on their side. He walked among the bodies that night, guided by lieutenants. He couldn't see the faces, but he could smell the blood. He could feel the flies beginning to gather. "Count them," he said. "Which ones, my lord?" "All of them." The count took 3 days. When it was finished, Žižka said nothing. He returned to his wagon and did not emerge until morning. The irony cut deeper than any sword. They had won, and it was destroying them. By 1424, Jan Žižka had broken 4 papal crusades. He had defeated every army sent against him. He had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that peasants with faith and firearms could shatter the military elite of medieval Europe. And the Hussite movement was eating itself alive. The factions that had united against Rome now turned their weapons on each other. The moderate Utraquists wanted to negotiate with the Church, accept some reforms in exchange for returning to Catholic communion. The radical Taborites wanted total separation, a new church built on Hussite principles. The Orbites followed their own prophets. The orphans, so called because they had lost their original leaders, pursued an even more extreme theology. These weren't academic disputes. Men were dying over whether communion wine should be served in 1 cup or 2. Villages were burning over the proper interpretation of Scripture. The Crusades had united them. Victory divided them. Žižka tried to mediate. He called councils where faction leaders could air grievances. He proposed compromises that satisfied no one. He reminded them, again and again, that Rome was watching, waiting for them to weaken. They didn't listen. In the spring of 1424, fighting broke out between Taborites and Utraquists near Prague. It was small at first. Skirmishes, burned farms, murdered priests. Then it escalated. By summer, full-scale battles were being fought between Hussites while the Pope's armies regrouped beyond the borders. Historians still debate whether Žižka could have prevented the civil war. His authority was immense. He was the blind general who had saved them all, but authority matters little when fanatics believe God speaks directly to them. He chose a side. The Taborites had been his people from the beginning. The moderates disgusted him. They wanted to compromise with the same church that had burned Jan Hus. He threw his weight behind the radicals, and the radicals threw their wagons against their former allies. The battles that followed were among the bloodiest of the Hussite wars. At Malishov, the same field where Žižka had broken the Fourth Crusade, Hussites killed Hussites. The Wagenburg tactics that had stopped knights now mowed down farmers. The handguns that had terrified crusaders now shattered Bohemian bodies. Žižka commanded these battles with the same brutal efficiency he'd shown against Rome. He gave no quarter. He expected none. Prisoners were executed. Villages that supported the wrong faction were burned. According to some accounts, he justified this as necessity. The revolution would die if it remained divided. Only total victory over the moderates could save the movement. According to other accounts, he had simply become what he had always been, a killer. The cause didn't matter, the enemy didn't matter, only the fighting mattered. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the darkness. By autumn 1424, Žižka had crushed the moderate resistance. The Utraquists fled Prague or submitted to Taborite authority. The Hussite movement was unified again, unified around Žižka's vision of total war against Rome. No compromise, no negotiation, no peace until the church itself fell. He was 64 years old, blind, sick. His body had been failing for years, held together by will and hatred. But he had one more campaign in him. The Fifth Crusade was gathering. Rome, encouraged by the Hussite civil war, believed the movement was finally vulnerable. German princes who had refused earlier calls now saw opportunity. The largest army yet, perhaps 100,000 men, was assembling for a final, overwhelming assault. Žižka didn't wait. In October 1424, he marched east with his Taborite army, planning to strike the crusade before it could fully form. He would catch them scattered, destroy them piecemeal, end the threat forever. He never made it. Somewhere on the road near Przybyslav, Jan Žižka contracted plague. The disease moved quickly. Within days, he was delirious. Within a week, he was dying. His captains gathered around his wagon, waiting for final orders. According to the chronicles, his last words concerned his skin. "When I am dead," he reportedly said, "flay my body and make a drum from my hide. Carry it into battle. Let my enemies hear me even after I am gone." Historians still debate whether he actually said this. The story appears in multiple sources, but plague victims rarely have the clarity for such requests. What's certain is that his followers believed he said it, and they honoured his wish. On October 11th, 1424, Jan Žižka died. He had never lost a battle. The plague took what no army could. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week of mourning that felt like the world ending. When Jan Žižka's heart stopped, the army stopped with it. Captains who had followed him through 4 crusades stood paralysed outside his wagon, unsure whether to continue the campaign or return home. The blind general had been their eyes for so long that without him they couldn't see. According to the chronicles, his body was prepared according to his wishes. The skin was removed and stretched. A frame was built, wood and leather, designed to be carried at the head of armies. The drum that resulted was crude, horrible and sacred. They called it Žižka's skin. For years afterward, Hussite armies carried it into battle. The sound, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond death, terrified crusaders who heard it. They believed the blind general was still with them, still commanding from beyond the grave. It was propaganda, of course. The dead don't command armies, but the legend served its purpose. Crusader morale, already fragile after 4 catastrophic defeats, cracked at the sound of the drum. The Fifth Crusade arrived in 1426. It was everything Rome had promised. Over 100,000 men, professional commanders, lessons learned from every previous failure. They advanced into Bohemia expecting to find a movement shattered by Žižka's death. They found the opposite. Žižka's captains had inherited his system. The Wagenburg, the handgones, the brutal discipline. They had also inherited his legend. And legends are harder to kill than men. At Ústí nad Labem, the Fifth Crusade met the Hussite armies and was destroyed. Not defeated, destroyed. The chronicles describe a slaughter so complete that the Crusader army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Bodies clogged the river. Armour littered the fields for miles. The survivors fled back to Germany carrying tales of demons and hellfire, of a dead man's drum that drove them mad, of peasants who could not be killed by knights or priests or God himself. Pope Martin V, who had declared the Crusades with such confidence, watched his armies dissolve. The German princes who had pledged men and money demanded their survivors back. The coalition that had united Catholic Europe against Bohemia shattered. There would be more Crusades. The sixth, in 1427, was turned back before it even reached Bohemian territory. The Crusaders heard Hussite hymns on the wind and fled. The seventh, in 1431, ended in similar humiliation. But these were aftershocks. The real war ended at Ústí nad Labem, when the Fifth Crusade drowned in blood and the Catholic powers of Europe finally accepted what Žižka had proven. They could not conquer Bohemia by force. The irony, of course, is that Žižka didn't live to see it. Historians still debate whether he would have been pleased by the outcome. His Taborite faction continued fighting for years, but the movement fractured again after his death. The orphans split from the Taborites, the Utraquists re-emerged, the civil wars resumed. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipny, moderate Hussites destroyed the radical factions that Žižka had led. The Taborites were broken, the orphans were scattered, the revolution that had begun with a man's execution and reached its height with a blind general's victories ended in fratricide and compromise. The Utraquists negotiated with Rome. They received some of their demands: communion in both kinds, vernacular scripture, reduced papal authority in Bohemia. They abandoned others. The church survived. The Pope survived. The system that had burned Jan Hus adapted and continued. And Žižka's legacy, his tactics revolutionized warfare. Military historians trace the development of combined arms, infantry, cavalry, and artillery working together directly to his innovations. His Wagenburg influenced the development of field fortifications for centuries. His emphasis on firepower over shot combat anticipated the end of the armoured knight by 200 years. But the man himself was erased. The Catholic chronicles portrayed him as a demon, a heretic, a monster who murdered innocents for pleasure. The Hussite moderates who made peace with Rome distanced themselves from his memory. He was too extreme, too bloody, too committed to a victory that couldn't be achieved. Even the drum made from his skin eventually disappeared. Whether it was destroyed, hidden, or simply lost, no one knows. The legend persisted longer than the relic. By 1450, Jan Žižka was a ghost story. The blind general who couldn't be defeated, the monster who ate crusades, the man who proved that faith and gunpowder could shatter any army. And then slowly even the ghost faded. The silence that followed his death was louder than any battle. Jan Žižka died in 1424. The Hussite wars continued until 1434. The crusades he had broken kept trying, and kept failing, until Rome finally accepted that Bohemia could not be conquered by force. But the man who made those victories possible was already becoming something else. Not a person, not even a memory, a weapon. The Taborites invoked his name to justify atrocities. The moderates invoked his name to claim legitimacy. The Catholics invoked his name to prove that heresy bred monsters. Everyone who touched his legacy corrupted it. Historians still debate whether Žižka would have recognized himself in the stories told after his death. The pious revolutionary fighting for religious freedom, the tactical genius who invented modern warfare, the blind hero who defeated impossible odds through faith alone. None of these were entirely true, none were entirely false. The truth is simpler and darker. Žižka was a mercenary who found a cause worth killing for. He killed until the killing broke something inside him. Then he kept killing because he didn't know how to stop. He won every battle he ever fought. Over 60 engagements across decades of warfare against the finest armies of his age, often blind and always outnumbered. No commander in medieval history could match that record. Few commanders in any history could match it. And what did his victories achieve? The revolution fractured after his death. The factions he had tried to unite tore themselves apart at Lipany. The moderate Hussites compromised with Rome, accepting half measures that would have disgusted him. The radical Taborites, his people, his army, were destroyed by their fellow Bohemians. The church survived, modified, weakened, but alive. The reforms Žižka demanded were granted partially, then gradually withdrawn over the following century. By 1500, Bohemia was Catholic again in all but name. The crusaders he had humiliated learned from their humiliation. They adopted his tactics: gunpowder, defensive warfare, combined arms, and used them against other enemies. The military revolution he sparked made future conquest more efficient, not less. Even his innovations turned against his legacy. The Wagenburg that had broken knights became the Lega that European colonizers used to subjugate indigenous peoples across the world. The firearms that had given peasants power against armor became the weapons of empire. History remembers the victory, it forgot the price. The chronicles record that Žižka was buried near Čáslav, though the location of his grave has been lost. The drum made from his skin, if it ever existed, disappeared sometime in the 15th century. His followers scattered or died. His faction was annihilated. What remains is a statue in Prague. An old man on a horse, one hand raised, his blind face turned toward an enemy he couldn't see. Tourists photograph it without knowing who he was. Locals pass it without looking up. And somewhere in the archives, in chronicles written by men who feared him, the truth survives in fragments. He was born around 1360 into minor nobility. He lost his left eye sometime before 1410. He fought at Grunwald. He joined the Hussites after Jan Hus burned. He invented the Wagenburg. He broke 4 crusades. He lost his right eye in 1421. He turned on his allies when they disappointed him. He died of plague at 64, commanding an army he could never see. He asked to be made into a drum. That request, whether true or legend, captures something essential about the man. Even in death, he wanted to terrify his enemies. Even beyond the grave, he wanted to win. The tragedy is that he did win. He won everything he set out to achieve. He won, and it changed nothing. The empire endured, the man did not. The church that killed Jan Hus survived another century, then fractured in the Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther, who admired Žižka and studied his tactics. The knights who fled from Žižka's wagons fathered sons who learned from their failure. The peasants who fought with flails were succeeded by peasants who fought with muskets. The world Žižka made possible was a world of gunpowder and religious war, of armies that could field firearms by the thousand, of conflicts that killed millions instead of thousands. He would not have recognized it, he might not have wanted it, but it was his legacy nonetheless. Jan Žižka saved Bohemia, he saved his faith, he saved his people from annihilation. Then he died, blind and alone, of a disease he couldn't fight, on a road to a battle he never reached. The armies he trained went home. The cause he served betrayed itself. And the story told afterward erased everything that mattered, except the killing. History remembers the blind general who couldn't be defeated. It forgot the man who couldn't stop fighting. They built statues. They didn't build graves.